Hi everybody, welcome to Module 7, talking about human spatial interaction. And in this video, we'll talk about 4 key points like we always do. The differences of these 4 key points basically wraps up the whole module. We're going to talk a little bit about interaction, distance, and barriers to human interaction. We'll briefly recall diffusion from last module because it plays into this. And then we'll talk about globalization and migration as other examples of human interaction across space. So first of all, we have this definition of what human interaction is, and this is this idea of communication and interdependencies between people, right? We all interrelate. We, not just in terms of talking to each other, but we also do things like, we make products, like somebody made an iPhone and then sent it to me, right? So that's an interaction I have with this person or people who made the iPhone across space. And what this does is it leads to an interdependence between geographic areas. Like in New England, we still want to drink orange juice, so we have this dependency on Florida to grow oranges and send them this way. If they want syrup for their pancakes, we got to do that and send it down to them. And so it creates this interdependency among different parts of the world. So there's movement between different places of a lot of different things, right? People move, goods move, information moves, communicable diseases move, so it's not always necessarily a good thing. And the amount of interaction is a function of the size of populations and the distance between them. There's kind of a rule of thumb in geography that says everything is related to everything else, but close things are more related to each other than things that are far apart. That's mostly true. However, in the age of globalization, sometimes that gets stretched a little bit. All right, so it says here the greater human interaction over short distances than long distances, as I was saying. You get this thing what's referred to as distance decay, which is a decline of an activity or function with increasing distance from the point of origin. So for instance, think about all the people that might go to a Boston Red Sox game. A lot of people in Boston are going to go, and then you're going to have other people in areas of Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire and maybe Rhode Island will go. And then the further you go, the less likely it is that someone's going to make it to a game, right? So there's a distance decay of who's going to a Red Sox game. By the time you get out to places like California, the only people that are going to come to a game at Fenway Park in Boston are going to be people who maybe go there once a year, if that. If they happen to like the Red Sox, which they probably don't if they're from California, that kind of thing. But anyway, you get this idea that as you go away from something, you have less and less interaction typically. And then with that, you also get something called the friction of distance, which is this idea that if something's far away, it means it has this friction in that it costs money to do it. It takes time, takes resources, that kind of thing. And so, like going back to the Red Sox example, well, that's why somebody from California isn't going to go to a game at Fenway, is because of this friction of distance. It's just too expensive, time consuming, etc. And so people will talk about distance sometimes in terms of real, like, kind of standard distance. Like earlier in the course, we talked about the difference between absolute and relative distance. And so, its distance is often a function of time. And people do this all the time. Like we'll say things like, well, how far is it from Keene to Boston? We'll say that it's, 2 hours. Instead of saying how many miles it is, that kind of thing. There's also psychological distance. There are some places that we have the perception as just kind of far away, or it's an area we don't really want to go to, and so it seems like it's really far, or that it's difficult to travel there. And this then leads us to barriers to interaction, why there sometimes don't get interaction across space. So barriers here are conditions that hinder either the flow of information or the movement of people, and thus, this is actually from the book, they actually use the word retard or prevent, the acceptance of an innovation. So in other words, if something is, like in the last module, I talked about like blues music, right? And the way in which that diffused in the 1930s or so with a part of the Great Migration. Some of the things that might keep people from moving along those migration paths and then diffusing this innovation is that the larger distances. I mean, one of the reasons it didn't diffuse as much to Europe is, well, that's a lot further away and it also costs a lot more, and so that was one of the barriers to interaction. It could also be other things like language difference. If there's an innovation in one particular language, it doesn't necessarily translate well into others, and so that's another thing that can be a barrier. So things like the physical environment, right? It's hard to move information or cultural traits over mountains, deserts, oceans, sometimes over rivers. And as mentioned, cultural barriers, different political systems, different ideologies, different religions. I mean, an example of this might be um, if we look at, say, some of the places where that are where strict versions of Islam are practiced, there are going to be certain kinds of innovations that aren't going to travel there. So, for instance, if there's a new style of bathing suit that people are wearing in Europe, well, you go to the Muslim world where there's much more prohibitive um, ideas of what people should wear, then that isn't going to diffuse there because there's a cultural barrier, right? That's not something they're going to pick up. Also, psychological barrier. In terms of barriers to interaction, we have reasons that sometimes we don't want to necessarily get in innovation. Um, and then also, from just our sense of privacy, we sometimes don't want to have, total interaction with everybody around us. So, okay, so one of the key terms here too is this idea of individual activity space. This is the area within which people move freely on their rounds of regular activity. And so typically you can think of that as like kind of your daily schedule, but it's not necessarily just daily. If you're a student, let's say at Keene, part of your daily schedule may be going to classes and going to Athens Pizza and going over to the grocery store and going to these different places, but also part of your activity space may be going home to where you're from if you're from out of town, on every other weekend or that kind of stuff. So your activity space can actually, over like a month or 2 month span, actually be somewhat stretched spatially. So oftentimes, here, talking about journey to work and, use of automobile means that your individual activity space can actually be quite extensive. But what kind of influences this, and you'll talk about this in the discussion questions, is the extent of your activity space is influenced by your stage in life, right? Whether you're a kid, they have a different activity space than people that are at working age, and that's different than teenagers, and that's different than retirees. Also the means of mobility available, what kind of activities or opportunities are there. But there are also things too in which socially sometimes things are restricted, particularly like around age, like where we expect kids can and cannot be, that sort of thing. Um, and then we also have what's called mental maps, the way people perceive places. And so these are parts of our activity space that we move into and that we think of as being kind of spaces that we are used to and familiar with and we have good associations with, and there may be places we avoid because we have negative associations with those areas. All right, so as mentioned in the last section, these things, cultural traits move and diffuse, right? And so spatial diffusion is the process by which a concept, practice, or substance spreads from its point of origin to new territories. I'm not going to beat this to death because we kind of went over it last module, so if you didn't see that last module, make sure you check it out because diffusion is the heart of geography of spatial interaction in terms of what geographers really look at and study, right? And we had these three examples of relocation diffusion, hierarchical expansion diffusion, and contagious expansion diffusion. Very important. I bring them up again here briefly because they kind of tie directly into our discussion next here of globalization, which here we are, key point number 3. All right. As most people are aware, there's an increasing interconnection of all parts of the world where different parts of the globe are brought into more interdependency and integration and interaction. And this affects economic processes, political processes, and also cultural patterns. And this is from the book, actually. It says, at present, its benefits accrue to a minority of the world's 7 billion people. In other words, even though globalization is something that impacts all of us, who benefits from the processes of globalization is not necessarily all of us. That some people are essentially making a killing economically off of this greater integration, and some people are actually hurt by it. Okay. And the video, one of the videos you'll watch for this section on kind of the relationship between Walmart and China and how that relationship developed in the early 2000s, kind of demonstrates how some people are winners and some people losers when you more globally integrate the systems of production. All right, so first off, what is globalization? And here's the definition. Processes of economic, political, and social integration that operate on a global scale and have collectively created ties that make a difference to lives around the planet. It's created from faster and more reliable transportation, almost instantaneous communication, and the creation of digital sources of information and media like the internet. And so it's important to note that if we go back to the last module and think about the different subsystems of culture, right, that this has a lot to do with the big changes in the technological subsystem of culture, right, that we have faster transportation. It's not just that the planes are faster or the trains are faster, it's also that, we have big ports that are more quickly can move things through them. There was a process what they call containerization, where a lot of goods that move internationally now are moved in containers, and so it made moving things through ports much easier than having to unload ships kind of willy-nilly. Now you just take out these big containers and it's all automated. That in of itself really facilitated the faster and more reliable movement of things across space. So when did it begin? Well, that depends on who you talk to. Globalization is sometimes considered a rather recent phenomenon, dating from since post World War II. But if we go back in time, you can think about the first kind of truly global systems of of economic activity and political activity, and probably could go back all the way to the 1600s, probably 1600s, when the Spanish Empire was really kind of a global empire, and then quickly thereafter the British. And that was really the beginning of tying most of the world into these global systems. Now, that to be said, the intensification of those global interactions has certainly increased. And so when we talk, in the last 50 to 60 years, so when we talk about globalization, it's not just somehow things were not tied together globally before that, but what we've seen more recently is an intensification of global processes. All right. So there's a couple different terms here that I wanted to bring up. One is interdependence, which kind of talked about, this idea that relations between regions or countries of mutual but not necessarily equal dependence, right? And so this is an example that different parts of the world are all kind of tied together in interdependence, which doesn't necessarily mean that everybody benefits the same. Like when I brought up the idea of orange juice for syrup or something that sounds very mutualistic, everybody wins, we all get orange juice and syrup. But it doesn't necessarily work that way, because there are certainly, we look back historically at global colonial empires, for instance, the way in which the globe has been integrated oftentimes is about the richer countries taking things from the poorer countries. That's the way in which they are interdependent, and so it's by no means always beneficial for all. Another key term here is the International Division of Labor, which is this idea that, well, first let me mention what division of labor is. That's the idea that in any society, different people do different tasks. So for instance, I teach online classes, hello. Other people fix cars, other people do, are doctors, other people are airline pilots. I don't do everything myself. I don't do my own heart surgery, I don't fly my own planes, that kind of stuff. I leave that to other people. And my heart surgeon doesn't teach geography classes, right? We have this division of labor within the society. The international division of labor is this idea that different countries or different places kind of specialize in certain types of activities. So right now, for instance, banking, right? Well, banking tends to happen in New York, London. The major banking or investment banking, are in those places like London, New York, Hong Kong, Tokyo, those kinds of places. Whereas some places concentrate on other things like manufacturing iPhones, right? It happens mostly in China. The automobile industry used to be more in Detroit, right? So there's this idea, not anymore so much, but anyway, you get this idea that different parts of the world are specializing in certain tasks. Now, one of the big big questions about globalization is, does it lead to cultural homogenization? In other words, does it make parts of the world all sort of the same? There's these terms like McDonaldization and Disneyfication, like somehow the whole world is essentially losing most of its cultural distinctiveness and is becoming kind of more the same through globalization. So it says here, increasingly linked and interdependent economic, political, and cultural networks might lead different groups of people to become more and more alike, but there's also a flip side to this. New global encounters have enabled increasing recognition of differences between groups of people too, and some people really revel in those. And it's not all one way. It's not like the rest of the world is just becoming somehow more American. Like for instance, through globalization, we also have the transmission of music from Africa to the United States, where now we kind of listen to some different music. Think of all the foods that people eat: Thai food, Chinese food, that have come from other places and affected what we do here in America, or the fact that, like I have a daughter who's totally into manga and anime stuff, which of course is an import from Japan. And so it doesn't necessarily make everybody the same, or it's not just one way, everybody becoming kind of Americanized. It's a little more complex than that. So tied to this, however, you have to think about, and I've kind of, I think, hit this point a bit, this idea of uneven development. Globalization doesn't necessarily make us all the same. Sometimes the tying together of different parts of the world happens because of unevenness and to also kind of perpetuates it. So for instance, there's this idea that's called the core periphery model or world systems theory. We'll talk about this more when we get to political geography here in a couple modules. But oftentimes it's taking advantage of difference. Like for instance, why is my iPhone made in China instead of in New Hampshire? Well, it's because China's labor is much, much cheaper. And the global kind of system of economics absolutely depends on that difference. And so it's not about every part of, if China's wages were the same as they were in New England, then we wouldn't be making iPhones in China. And so that's part of the thing about globalization, is it actually doesn't make every place the same. It depends upon difference between places too, to kind of make it function. I'm not saying that's moral, I'm just saying that's kind of the way in which it actually operates. So you do get some integration and more interaction through things like, through economic integration of the global economy. You get some places kind of coalescing into regions, things like the Eurozone in Europe, where all the economies kind of came together so they can compete more in the global marketplace. And of course, you have the investment of money now happens everywhere all over the world, international banking. You have all these what are called TNCs, or transnational corporations. And as you'll see from the China and Walmart video, trade doesn't occur from country to country. It happens usually within companies. So in other words, it's not like when they talk about trade between China and the United States, it's not like Chinese firms are over there handing things across the border to American firms that are then bringing it in. It's American firms are based in China, they're making stuff and then bringing it into the US, and their profits are actually staying in the United States. And so it's a little different than kind of traditional forms of trade from, decades past. And of course, global marketing. People now market and sell things all over the globe. In addition to that economic integration, we also have political integration, where you have these, large, what are called supranational organizations, things like, not just like the European Union or NAFTA or these kinds of groups, but also alliances like NATO that are multinational, but also organizations like the United Nations, right? Of course, is a global political body. And then in terms of cultural integration, kind of talked a little bit about this in terms of whether it's really homogenizing. But popular Western culture, particularly American culture, is a major part of what is being sent around the world, because the United States has such a developed system of kind of production of things like movies and TV and music and all of that. So people watch Hollywood movies and they listen to American artists. There's some that comes the other way. Some people will watch Bollywood movies from India and that sort of thing, but it's a little, it's uneven in terms of which way the influence goes. English has then also become very important in terms of as a global language, and because of, if you can learn English regardless of where you are, you can tap into a lot of these global information flows and also things like music and entertainment. And so there's a lot of impetus to learn English, even if you're in a place where people around you are not necessarily speaking it, because it kind of gives you access to this global the global culture. And of course, there it says that both the dominance of English and globalization of popular culture are resented by many people, and of course rejected by some. And some people don't like the fact that it seems to be leading to a homogenization of culture, although that's a little bit contested. All right, key point number 4, migration. And the key point here is people move. Immigration, of course, is a big political issue and has been for some time and probably will be for a long time. But people move, they always have. Migration is defined as the permanent relocation of place of residence and your activity space, and it's become a very pressing concern in recent decades. So the effects of migration, it affects national economies. If you're losing a lot of people or you're gaining a lot of people, that's going to affect your economy. Who's getting jobs. That's one of the concerns usually when immigration is coming into a place is, are these people taking jobs that other people in those areas could have had, that kind of thing. It also, of course, affects population density and distribution. One of the big migrations going on now is from the rural areas of the world to the urban areas of the world, making those populations more dense. It alters traditional ethnic, linguistic, and religious mixtures, right, as people with different cultural traits move around to different areas. And it inflames national debates and international tensions and calls for people to build walls and this sort of thing. So there's a couple types of migration. The first thing to recognize is that migration is a very gendered activity, and I'll talk a little more about this here in a second, but that a large majority of migrants typically is more male than female, but not always, and sometimes very different kind of patterns. Like, for instance, take a place like the Philippines, which has a lot of people that migrate out. A lot of the women that are migrating out are having particular kinds of jobs in certain places, often associated with child care or that kind of thing. And they go to places like the parts of Asia or the United States or Canada, whereas a lot of the men from the Philippines are going into work in places like the Gulf region or also sometimes in places in Asia, doing very different kinds of work. So sometimes who migrates can be influenced a lot by gender. So migration occurs at different scales. It happens across continents, intercontinental, from continent to continent. It happens intracontinental, in other words, from one part of a continent to another, and also within regions, or between regions or within regions. So for instance, people coming from Mexico to the United States would be intracontinental. People coming from the Philippines to the United States would be intercontinental. Two terms that sometimes are confused because they sound the same: immigration and emigration. Immigration is when people come into a place. Emigration is when people are leaving. And so with the or migration, but that doesn't sound right, but immigration coming in, emigration leaving. So migration can be forced, can be done reluctantly or voluntarily. And in terms of the incentives to migrate, decisions to move as a cultural and temporal is very variable, right? Voluntary migrants may seek better economic, political, or cultural conditions. And I think I've mentioned in previous modules, but if not, this idea that push factors and pull factors are very important. Push factors are the negative things that are pushing you out of where you are. Pull factors are the positive characteristics of a location that are attracting them. Making a decision to migrate involves push and pull factors. However, push factors are usually dominant. People don't tend to leave a place unless there's some real negative reasons why they cannot stay there. And it's sometimes very much overlooked. Like, we'll talk a little bit here in a second about like migrants from Syria and other parts of the Middle East moving into Europe. That's really obvious what the push is that there's a civil war going on in Syria and people are trying to flee and leave it. But in some other places, it's not recognized as much, like migration from Mexico to the United States. People don't recognize just how bad the situation is economically, politically, in terms of safety in rural parts of Mexico, and that's why some people are leaving and going towards the northern frontier and then to the United States. It's not just the pull of a better life in the United States, it's also the push of how bad things have gotten in the rural areas of Mexico. So, in terms of incentives, again, there's economic considerations. Usually the most common is, not being able to make it where you are and looking for better jobs elsewhere. Escaping extreme poverty. Sometimes environmental degradation going on in a place makes it unlivable, and so people are leaving for those reasons. Think of like a lot of the people who left New Orleans because of Hurricane Katrina would be considered environmental refugees, and even though they're not international refugees, mostly, they moved to places like Texas or California or Mississippi or places in the surrounding area. They had to leave because of an environmental disaster. You have, of course, rural to urban migration and international migration. Sometimes it's political, escaping war or persecution or the promise of a better life and freedom in a new place. And it says here there's also cultural variables. Migrants are attracted to areas where language, religion, and racial ethnic background of inhabitants are similar in terms of why people are picking particular places. Often they're looking for something that's going to be relatively comfortable. And they may also be looking for particular amenities. Things like This can vary by the kind of person who's migrating, but things like educational opportunities, access to health care, these kinds of things can also be incentives to migrate. So young adults are typically the most mobile, and the initial decisions tend to be about occupation, like where to go to get jobs. They don't have as many ties to family or kids and institutions, and lack of opportunities in the home area. And so that's why oftentimes it's young adults. But in some cases where, particularly if it's like refugees that are being pushed out of a place, it can be whole families. Often the goal of a migrant is to minimize uncertainty, and that can be achieved through a lot of different techniques. And one of them is step migration, which is that eventual long-distance relocation is undertaken in stages. So we see this in the European example where people are leaving Syria, going into refugee camps, like maybe in Turkey, staying there for a little while, gathering resources and connections, then maybe going to a major city like Istanbul, staying there for a little bit, and then trying to make the push into Europe, and then maybe landing in Greece or Italy with the idea of later getting up to like Germany or Sweden. You also get what's called chain migration, where migration from a common home area to a specific destination is sustained by links of friendship or kinship between first movers and later followers. An example of this would be, a great example would be like Chinese migration to the United States, where some people from China got settled into particular places in the United States, and then when Chinese migrants came, they tended to follow the same migration path that those earlier people that were Chinese followed. And so you get places like Chinatowns, or a lot of different ethnic groups have these particular places where they are. Chinatowns is a little bit of an interesting case in that a lot of times Chinese people were forced to live in these isolated, separate areas of towns by American authorities. But you also know there's other examples of ethnic groups where they come in and then will tend to move into the same places that kind of people from their home country had moved initially. So many people, of course, still choose not to migrate, even when conditions are bad. As we know, sometimes people just don't want to leave. People have limited knowledge of opportunities elsewhere. They may be less likely to migrate, and some people, of course, just don't want to leave the connections and jobs and things that they have behind. One of the places I do research in Japan, in the Fukushima area, you would think this would be an example of like environmental refugees, where people would be fleeing the area because of contamination, but a lot of people don't leave because they have jobs there, because they have family there, because they feel a obligation and duty to reconstruct the area, those kinds of things. And so these are sometimes barriers for people to leave a place. And of course, there's other things like physical barriers. It may be difficult, and I'll talk about this in the European context. Or people migrating from Mexico to the United States, you got to cross a desert or get around a fence, that sort of stuff, and it's a barrier to migration. And there's economic barriers. It's expensive to try and migrate. You're dropping everything. You got to have some resources to be able to make the trip and then get established in a new place. Okay, I'm going to skip over a couple of these and just get to the example of your current European migration from the Middle East. This is a map showing the different routes that people are taking into Europe right now. And as you can see, it's not just from Syria, it's also from other parts of the Middle East. It's also from parts of East Africa and other parts of North Africa, Libya. A lot of people are leaving because of the instability there, as well as also political instability and economic situations in these parts of West Africa are moving into Europe too. So why are so many people trying to flee? Well, there's a lot of single explanations out there about one reason or another. Obviously, the war in Syria is a big one, or poverty, or these kinds of things. But we have to think about it in kind of in fact, that there's a lot of different factors that come into this. And so this is actually an older piece of data. I thought I had the newer one in there, sorry, but this is talking about the number of deaths that are occurring by people trying to cross the Mediterranean, and you can see the numbers for 2014, halfway through 2015. I thought I had the data all the way to the end of 2015, but see, I'll go to the next slide. There we go. This is, I believe, showing the number of arrivals and deaths through the entire, through close to the end of 2015. This was released at the end of 2015. And you can see that the majority of deaths are happening here in the central Mediterranean, of people trying to cross from Africa into Italy in these areas, but there have been deaths out here in Spain, as well as deaths over here coming into Greece. And about, in 2015, there was the death of a small 3-year-old child trying to migrate from Turkey into Greece. And this caused a lot of very, it was a very big kind of, what do you call it? I don't know, scandal is the right word, but it drew a lot of attention to the plight of these immigrants trying to escape from Syria and come into the European Union, while the European Union was trying to disallow migration. So, what are some of the reasons why people oppose migration? Well, sometimes it's economic. This idea of are people there going to take jobs or be some kind of burden on the society. Issues of identity. Some people want to keep the culture of a place more homogeneous and don't want the culture to shift or change based on the ideologies and different cultural traits of the people coming in. There's also this idea of security, like perhaps the people that are coming in are a criminal or security or terrorism risk. There's also the idea of containing problems. That, for instance, if there's instability in things in Syria, that if you're just letting all the people from Syria then come into Europe, that this could then destabilize Syria, mostly through things like crime and terrorism and that sort of thing. Also, there are calls for national unity. So, in other words, some of these countries, like this was big in places like Hungary and Romania, where they didn't want people coming in with different linguistic and religious and ethnic backgrounds because they feel like it would undermine their kind of national unity. There are also environmental concerns. People coming in as refugees use more resources when they are in the actual act of moving into these areas. They don't have facilities. If there's tens of thousands of people migrating in a particular route and there's no sanitation, there's no toilets, there's no trash, pick up that kind of stuff, it can have this negative environmental impact. And on the receiving nation, having a higher population can have a bigger impact environmentally, but also on social services, education, etc. But a lot of it also comes down to just this concept of who we think of as we. So if you're a person that thinks of themselves, let's say, hypothetically as a German, and you see people coming in from Syria, and you don't kind of think of them as part of we, right, or as part of us, that they're kind of different people, that you need to solve your problems for yourself and for other Germans, then you don't kind of include those people. If, however, you see the migrants coming in from Syria as fellow human beings that are much like you, that also need help, that are in a position that you could very well be in, etc., and you do accept them as being part of who we are, then you're much more likely to not kind of turn them away when they're migrating or refugees. Okay. So we've got some videos to watch here for this section. One is on the Walmart in China and the U.S. economy and how that shifted in the early 2000s, and then a couple videos about Syria and the refugee crisis that will make some of the things I just talked about kind of put it more into context. That's it. So be sure to read the chapter for this module too, but that's it. Okay, see you next module.